Okay, so good morning, good evening, good night, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. It's so great to have you here. I can see we currently have 23 people signed up. Can you all hear me clearly?
Yes, clear.
Okay. All right. So it's so great to have you all. You're welcome to the pre-conference for the third Human-Animal Interactions Conference in Africa. Please feel free to share in the chat box where you are joining us from. It's so great to already see people like Dr. Chidi Willie joining from Botswana. We have Dr. Masden from Kenya. I can see a few other names as well before now. So please share where you're joining us from in the chat box. Let us know where you are connecting to this conference from. And a few announcements I'd love to make before we kickstart the meeting proper. First of all, please ensure that the name on the Zoom profile that you're using matches the name that you registered with earlier, so that it's easy for us to be able to sort out names and be able to issue certificates later on after the event. Another thing is, please feel free to share information about events that are happening that are related to this as well. Please feel free to share links that you feel will be of a value to people that are attending the conference and all of that in the chat box. So like previous years, we have a lot of these things happen. So there's activity going on in the chat box, and those are things that would equally aid the learning process. Another thing is, please note that this event serves as an informative and educational platform, and equally doubles as a networking and connection platform as well. So please feel free to share in the chat box what your specialty or areas of proficiency are. And equally feel free to share in the chat box if there are people or skill sets that you would love to connect with, or professionals or areas you would love to connect with professionals in. For us, the ultimate aim for this conference are to see that these services grow on the continent of Africa. So whatever connections can be done with us or without us to help this grow, we would be really glad. And then I would equally love to state at this point that we have 2 alternate hosts for this event, just so that in case anything goes wrong with my internet, which has happened before, even in the conference that we held in April, the alternate hosts would take over from wherever the meeting is and then continue until I'm able to log in back. And I would first of all want to quickly introduce the alternate hosts for the event and probably have them just do a quick hello to everyone. So we have Deborah Brown Machakodumi as one of the alternate hosts. Deborah is a grant acquisition specialist for humanitarian, transitional, and development aid interventions. He currently works at Christian Blind Mission, where she supports the acquisition of international institutional donor grants. She's a disability inclusion activist, and she's the founder and creative director of Kids Ability Initiative, a nonprofit that engages and promotes the creative abilities of children with disabilities and advocates for their rights to education. So Deborah, please quickly say hello so that people hear your voice.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much, Dr. Seno, and everyone who has worked so hard to put this together. And thank you, Tiffani, for, we're looking forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. And the second alternate host is Praise Akobo. Praise is a social entrepreneur. She is currently a final year veterinary medicine student, and she's the co-founder of Youths with a Difference, an organization that is set to help Nigerian and African youths to cause a paradigm shift and help them to grow in various facets of life. She is a Mandela Washington Fellow, so which means a 2023 Mandela Washington Fellow, which means she's currently in the United States. So Praise, please do say hello as well. Praise, are you available?
Okay, sorry. I
I'm using two devices at the moment, so that's why. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. It's amazing to be here. Thank you, Dr. Tiffani. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
so thank you very much. So these are some of the members of my team, my technical team. We equally have Dr. Dauda, who is a member of the technical team and who is available as well. Dr. Dauda, please a very quick hello.
Hello, everyone. Happy to see you here. Dauda from Calabar, Nigeria.
Okay, so thank you. So you welcome everyone. Welcome Jackie from the UK, Dr. Ayuba from Nigeria, Dr. Bodo from Nigeria, Hannah Harris from UK, Lorato from Botswana, Oketso from South Africa, and everyone else who is on the call right now. It's so great to have you all join us. And we will be going straight into the event for today. And I would love to introduce the speaker that we have for the pre-conference. So our speaker for today is a senior research fellow in the School of Psychology and Public Health at Latrobe University in Australia. She has extensive experience in research on animal welfare, dog owner relationships, and assistant dogs, including survey, focus groups, and behavioral studies. She recently completed a 4-year trial funded by the Australian Department of Veteran Affairs to understand the effectiveness of assistant dogs as an adjunct to treatment for veterans with PTSD. She has also jointly led a project commissioned by the Australian National Disability Insurance Agency, in which existing scientific literature was reviewed to determine the effectiveness of assistant dogs. Other recently completed projects include understanding the benefits and disadvantages of owner-trained assistance dogs, awareness of assistance dog public access rights among the general public, whether social interactions within the community increase when people with an intellectual disability go on outings with a therapy dog, and the impact of courtroom dogs for survivors of sexual and family violence. In 2022, along with 75 co-authors, which I was privileged to be one of them,
Yeah.
she published an article that defines commonly used terms in animal-assisted services. The open access paper can be downloaded with the link that is in the brochure that was sent to the mail, to your mails for all the participants. So here today to present on the topic human-animal bond, defining support roles, please make welcome Dr. Tiffani Howell.
Thank you very much, Sunday. That was a lovely introduction, and probably I should have made it shorter. I didn't realize it was going to be long. So yeah, thanks very much for having me. It's really great to see so many people already logged on to be part of this conference. This isn't even the conference proper, just the pre-conference. It's really exciting to see that this type of work is taking off, you know, all over the world. So let me share my screen with you. I'm allowed. Okay, everybody should be able to see the presentation view of my talk. Is that correct? Yes. Okay, all right, great. Okay, so the reason why we did this work, Sunday and I, among others, was because it became very clear over the course of the past decade or so plus that I've been working in this area, that people are using terms, they're using terms in very inconsistent ways. So we kind of saw it a little bit in the literature, in the academic literature, but then at some point, the Australian government came to us because there's an agency in the Australian government that funds supports for people with disability, including various animal supports. So assistance animals and therapy animals and so on. And they came to us and they said, well, when somebody says that they want a therapy animal, what does that mean? And my colleagues and I were like, well, I don't know, you know, it could mean lots of different things. And so they actually contracted us to try to answer this question. And this is, you know, this is something that we've been working on for a really long time. We started in 2018. Now, the International Association for Human-Animal Interaction Organizations, or IAHIO, had already defined various types of animal-assisted services or animal-assisted interventions. So they have actually defined what is animal-assisted therapy, but they didn't define what a therapy animal was. So they did that in 2014, and then they updated it in 2018. But around that time was when we realized that, okay, now we know what animal-assisted therapy means and animal-assisted education, animal-assisted activities, and so on, but we don't know what a therapy animal. So when people say a therapy dog, what are they talking about? So that conversation with the government started what turned out to be a very, very long process and very complex with lots of different players. Because we decided that instead of when I say we, what I mean at this point is my mentor, Professor Pauline Bennett, and myself. So we were working together on this, and we thought, we could try to do a literature review and try to come up with definitions ourselves, or we could take it to, a much broader range of practitioners, researchers, end beneficiaries working in this space, and we could all try to decide together what these terms actually mean. And in 2018, around the time that we were having these initial conversations, a conference was going to be held in Sydney, which of course we're based in Melbourne, so it's very close. Relatively speaking anyway. Australia is very far away from everything, but Sydney and Melbourne are not that far from each other, and we were all going to be going to this conference for the International Society for Anthrozoology. That's sort of the peak body internationally for research into human-animal interactions, relationships, and so on. So we thought, well, look, they're all coming here for this conference, so let's ask them. So we did that, and we put together a workshop as part of the conference, and we said, so help us define a few terms: assistance animals, companion animals, emotional support animals, therapy animals, and so on and so on and so on. So we started that process in 2018. In 2020, the ISS conference was online, and so we held another online workshop at that point with even more delegates to try to, by that point we had sort of draft definitions, but we wanted to take the draft definitions back to these sort of experts and ask them what they thought and how we could improve the definitions. So that's what we did. And in the end, we got a paper. 4 years later, we published a paper. We had representation from 6 continents and from people with expertise in a very wide range of topics. So we had, of course, human-animal relationship researchers, we had veterinarians, we had behaviorists, we had legal experts, we had housing experts, we had social workers, psychologists, all sorts of things. We had practitioners from various different fields, and we had some end beneficiaries. So we had a couple of assistance dog owners who were on this list of authors. And of course, as you can see here, I have highlighted Sunday's important role. He was responsible for providing information about Africa, because one of the things that we wanted to do with this paper was not just to provide definitions, because actually other people had tried to do that in the past, but we wanted to take a more global perspective. So the work that had been done in the past was primarily based in the US. And so they took a sort of a US-centric view, not criticizing, in Australia, I take an Australia-centric view. That's just kind of the way it is. But we decided, because we wanted to make it something that would be useful for people outside of Australia, we decided to go really broad. And so we tried to get perspectives from all over the world. And some of the authors, of whom Sunday was one, were responsible for writing a short section on how the definitions that we came up might be relevant in the context of their continent. Now, obviously, continents are huge places, and they're culturally very diverse, and linguistically, and geographically. But you've got to draw the line somewhere. We couldn't do it country by country, so we did sort of region by region. So this is the end result. It is available open access. There is a short URL if you want to use that. And as Sunday said, it is also in the little booklet that you would have been given. Okay, so what are the definitions that we came up with? The first one that we came up with was assistance animal. And now we define this as an animal who performs at least one identifiable task or behavior to help a person with a disability to mitigate the impacts of that disability. And they also need to be trained to a standard of behavior and hygiene that's appropriate to access public spaces that are off limits to other animals. So the classic example is the guide dog or the seeing eye dog, who helps somebody with a vision impairment to navigate successfully through their community. But more recently, there have been lots of other types of roles that these animals are filling. It's still mostly dogs. I'd say probably 99% dogs doing this work. But there are also, in Australia, there are a couple of assistance cats that I know of. And in some places, they have like miniature horses and ponies that will do this sort of work. And I think it's really good to have species other than dogs doing this kind of work sometimes, because not everybody can have a dog. Some people are afraid of dogs. Some people are allergic to dogs. Other people just don't like dogs. So having other types of animals who are able to fill these roles is really useful. So like I said, guide dogs, classic example, but some of the more recent type of work that these animals are doing, things like medical alerts. So if somebody has diabetes or epilepsy, the animal can be trained to alert them to a change in blood sugar, or if they're epileptic, if they're about to have a seizure, so that they can take steps to protect themselves and protect their health. Hearing assistance animals for people with hearing impairments, mobility assistance animals, you see those more and more. People in wheelchairs, for example, will often rely on mobility assistance animals to do things like help them open doors, get laundry out of the machine, and so on. Psychiatric assistance animals, anecdotally, I'd say this is probably the fastest growing area for assistance animals. These are, for post-traumatic stress disorder, other types of anxiety disorders. It's just a very quickly growing area. And then you have assistance animals for developmental disorders like autism spectrum disorder. So you might see autism assistance animals who are helping a child with autism to sort of remain calm and be able to function, out in the community. Now, for service animal, we considered this to be synonymous with assistance animal. So in general, in particular in places like the US and Denmark, I believe the legal statutes use the term service animal or service dog in the legislation. So, but it's basically the same role as an assistance animal. So they'll be performing behaviors that help a person mitigate the effects of their disability, and they have public access because they're trained to a high standard of behavior and hygiene. So service animal basically means the same thing as assistance animal, but we recommended phasing it out over time. So because we just don't think that it's really helpful to have two terms that are describing the same role. And that kind of was, that's basically the whole reason why we did this in the first place, because in some cases you'll have two terms that describe the same role, or you might have two different roles being described using the same term. It was all very confusing, and it would be really nice if when you read the name of the animal that you just automatically knew sort of what, that we all know we're talking about the same thing. That's kind of the end game here. So having two terms to describe the same type of work just seems a little bit unnecessary. But as I said, service dog or service animal is written into the legislation in some places. So we're not expecting that the US Congress is going to read our paper and say, well, we need to change this. We accept that we have limited power there. So in the meantime, we recommend that when you see the word service animal, that you just understand that that's going to be synonymous with assistance animal. Now, emotional support animal is kind of a confusing one for some people, particularly in the US. This was becoming an issue because emotional support animals were sometimes given the same sort of public access rights as assistance animals, but they're not the same thing. So an emotional support animal is one who lives with and provides emotional benefit for or support for the person as confirmed by a qualified health professional. So it's basically, it's the key difference between an assistance animal and an emotional support animal is the training. So with assistance animals, they are trained to perform at least one task or one behavior that mitigates the impacts of the person's disability. So for somebody with a psychiatric assistance animal, for example, they might be trained to notice that and to alert them of that. And I'm sure, some people, we've probably all found ourselves to be quite stressed all of a sudden, and then we think back and we're like, actually there was a lot of things leading to this point, but we're not necessarily aware of our physiological. It's high, and the same is true for people with psychiatric disabilities. Sometimes they're not necessarily aware of that change in their physiology, but dogs and other animals can really be taught to recognize those things and just to let them know. So they can remove themselves from the situation that is starting to sort of make them feel a little bit unpleasant. So an assistance animal is trained to perform a task that mitigates the impact of a person's disability. They're also trained for public access. Emotional support animals do not have to be trained for any of those things. So they don't need any sort of training at all, in fact. So they should not have public access. And that is now sort of being corrected in the US after there were some instances that were highly publicized in the media about emotional support animals being allowed onto planes and then creating havoc. So it's basically, an emotional support animal does not require the level of training that an assistance dog does, and consequently, they do not have the public access rights that an assistance animal has. So there is, of course, some confusion around what's a psychiatric assistance animal in particular compared to an emotional support animal. But as I said, psychiatric assistance animals, as well as guide dogs, autism assistance animals, mobility assistance animals, they're all trained to perform tasks where emotional support animals are not. Okay, so the next set is one is companion animal. Now, companion animals are their pets, so and they're usually recognized that way. So in most of the stuff that you read on in the public sphere as well as in academic writing, the term companion animal means a pet animal. So they don't have any sort of specialized employment training. They don't have a job. But the reason why we wanted to put this in here was because there used to be some assistance animal providers that were using the term companion animal to refer to an animal that is not a pet. So they have more extensive training and stuff. And for some reason, they were using the term companion animal. So we thought, let's put that in there just to be completely clear that when we talk about a companion animal, we strongly recommend that be considered a pet animal. Okay, emotional or school support animal, educational or school support animal. So this is an animal working in educational settings or schools that engages in goal-directed structured programs or services with outcomes that are educational or developmental in nature. Now, this thing about the goal-directed structured program and the educational outcomes, that is pulled almost straight out of Ohio's definition of animal-assisted education. So where we could, we adapted the definitions provided by IAHIO. Remember at the beginning I said IAHIO defined animal-assisted therapy, animal-assisted education, and so on. So when we could, we kind of adapted those definitions. We've just flipped them a little bit to describe the animal working in those scenarios as opposed to the scenario itself. So that's what an educational or school support animal is. It's not just an animal that's living in a school. If an animal is living in a school, that doesn't necessarily make them an educational support animal. They might just be a pet that happens to be based at the school, but they're not really doing anything. They're not part of any sort of program. Now, facility animal is this was a really big one, and it was quite annoying because it's used to describe lots of different types of roles. And so when we were doing the original literature review, trying to make sense of what facility animal is, we just were very sort of quite frustrated by the fact that there's no real clear definition or limits to what that word means. So we thought, okay, let's try to fix that. So we briefly we defined it as an animal trained to work in a particular type of in a specific facility, like a hospital or a school, or a specific context. So you might be talking about legal setting. So a legal setting would mean, everything from the prosecutor's office for intake interviews straight through to the courthouse for the trial. But we think that these in most cases, the animals described as facility animals would actually fall under a different category that we've already come up with. So a facility animal working in a school that's part of a goal-directed structured program, well, that would be an educational support animal. An animal living in a hospital, but not actually doing anything, they're just like the owner's pet, that's a companion animal. So what we did instead is we recommend limiting the use of this term to legal settings and calling them just as facility animals. The reason why we did that is because there are these sort of so-called courthouse dogs, particularly in the US, but there's also some in South America. There are a couple in Australia. They're sort of expanding gradually. They're taking over, taking over the world. But the type of work that they do is quite different from the other definitions that we came up with. They really are trying to help survivors of typically sexual or family violence get through a really tough process. And the nature of the work that they do it's not really a therapy animal. It's not really an educational animal. It's not a companion animal. So we thought, okay, let's give them that term, but let's then call it a justice facility animal for legal settings. Okay, almost done with the definitions. So the therapy animal is an animal who's included into the work of a qualified health professional in the provision of a structured goal-directed treatment. So this could be things like therapeutic horse riding for people with mobility impairments to try to learn to improve gait and balance and things like that. It could also be animal-assisted psychotherapy to try to improve, mental health outcomes or, social skills, things like that. It is not an animal that just goes into a hospital, school, elderly care facility to bring enjoyment to the people in that space. Oftentimes that's how they are referred. And there are actually organizations where in the name they have the word therapy animal or therapy dog or something of that nature, but that's not what they're actually doing. What we would call those animals would be visiting or visitation animals. So these are companion animals that have suitable characteristics, so they're like calm, friendly, and they're trained for public visitation by people who volunteer to take them into the facilities to bring enjoyment or other well-being improvements to the people in those facilities. So hospitals, elderly care facilities, and schools are sort of the most common spaces for this type of work. but the humans are usually the owners of the animal, but they don't necessarily have any specific qualifications. So they're not health professionals, they're not educational professionals, they're not teachers necessarily. They just have a pet who is really relaxed and happy and likes to meet random strangers, and they work with their pet to be trained up so that they can have the training and the sort of the knowledge to go into facilities and do unstructured activities with people and just help make people feel happy. That's basically the ultimate goal. So we recognize that the people who are running these visitation organizations, the training organizations for these programs, if they have the term therapy animal in the name, they're probably not going to want to change the name of their company. But nonetheless, we think that it's important to differentiate between a therapy animal who is actually involved in a specific type of therapy versus an animal who's involved in improving well-being, but nothing structured or goal-directed. Last but not least, we have skilled companion animals. So this is why we put in the companion animal definition earlier, because some assistance dog providers were using this term to describe animals who are trained to help a person with a disability, and they have the standards of behavior and access, so that behavior and hygiene, so that they can access public spaces, but they're handled by a facilitator rather than the person with the disability. So the most common example of this would be an autism assistance dog for a child with autism. So it's the child who is receiving the support and the benefits, and the dog has the public access rights to go where the child goes, but the handler of the animal is actually usually the parent or guardian. So you can't have an 8-year-old child being responsible for meeting the needs of an animal. So instead of that, the child's parent or guardian is that person who's responsible. So we think that that's it's really splitting hairs, I think. And because it is very similar to companion animal, we recommend just phasing this term out and just referring to these animals as assistance animals. We recognize that there is a slight difference in sort of the handling arrangements, that it's sort of a three-way arrangement as opposed to one-on-one. So instead of the person with the disability and the dog, it's the person with disability and the dog and the handler. But nonetheless, like the nature of the work that they do is very similar, and it's just very confusing to have more terms for no good reason, frankly. So that's why we recommend just phasing that out and just call them assistance animals. That's really what they are. Now, as I said at the beginning of this talk, we did, as part of the paper that we wrote, we looked at how our terms could be, what sort of implications they might have in different parts of the world. Sunday worked on Africa, so thanks again for that, Sunday. And what we found about Africa is that there is an inconsistent uptake of legal standardization throughout the continent in terms of these animal assisted services. So I don't think that's unusual. I think that's pretty common, but hopefully that will change over time. And I think that the work that you all are doing collectively on this is really going to help push that forward. There are a few peak bodies who are starting to operate in Africa, and they do provide globally accepted standards for welfare and behavior, as well as definitions. So IO, as I said before, this the second one, AAII, is, I believe, Animal Assisted Interventions International, and SCAS is the Society for Companion Animal Studies. So they are sort of stepping foot in Africa, and hopefully they also will be part of the push to keep things standardized. So what we hope is that as the industry develops in Africa, that these definitions could be something that could be sort of foundational. So in places like Europe and the US and Australia, where these sorts of services have existed for a while, we're working backwards. We're trying to fix a problem that has been created over the course of decades. Whereas in Africa, we have an opportunity to just get it right from the beginning. Now, I don't mean to say that our definitions are the final word on the subject. I imagine that they will need to change over time, and the types of roles that animals are filling is growing every day. So in 5 years' time, we might need to have this conversation again. There may be new types of roles that we need to deal with. But this, in Africa particularly, these definitions could really help provide us a level of standardization from the ground up. That's what we hope. Now, I can't not talk about welfare, animal welfare in this context, because there is not enough emphasis on animal welfare in the research that's been done. That's starting to change very slowly. But I think that in any animal-assisted service, the animals are our partners in the work that's being done. So they are not servants, they are not tools, they are equal. And of course, we facilitate them and we manage them and we have to look after them, but they should be considered volunteers in the process, and they should be not just willing to do the work that we're asking them to do, but they should actively enjoy it. They should want to do it. We experience such profound benefits from the work that they do for us. The least we can do is make sure that they're happy when they're doing it. So I want to take you through just a couple of slides with the evidence on animal welfare in various types of roles that these animals are doing. So first, I'll talk a little bit about assistance animals. So as I said before, these are the sort of the guide dogs and the mobility assistants and psychiatric assistance animals. And there were a couple of reviews that have been done recently looking at the welfare, the evidence of animal welfare for assistance animals. And what they found was that welfare is rarely included in any legislation governing assistance animals. So oftentimes in legislation, assistance animals do exist, so they are mentioned there, usually in the context of disability access rights, that they're considered to be a necessary disability support. They have public access rights because they have to go where their owner goes so that they can provide support for their owner wherever they are. But in this legislation, there's almost never any sort of mention of the welfare of the animal. So that's not good enough. The training process and the integration process, so that's when the dog and handler, or the animal and the handler sort of move in together and start living together, that's reportedly very stressful for owners, and it also may be stressful for the animals themselves, so that needs to be tested more carefully. They found in autism assistance dogs, there are particular behavioral indicators that might be sort of a welfare concern. One is meltdowns. So one of the characteristics of autism is that the people become so overwhelmed that they just completely lash out. So they have what was called a meltdown. And that experience can be, in addition to being highly stressful for the person with autism, it can also be very stressful for the dogs who are around them. And then some other sort of concerns were lack of routine, lack of rest periods, and unpredictable behavior by the child. So that's specific to autism assistance dogs in the research, but it might be relevant for other types of assistance animals as well. And then there's some concern among psychiatric assistance dogs that there might be some emotional contagion. So when the person's arousal levels start going up and up and up, maybe that's also stressful for the dogs. Now, there has been one study looking at this there, and they didn't find any increase in long-term or short-term cortisol in assistance dogs for veterans with PTSD. So that's good news. That means that there's no evidence of increased stress due to the working role. So that's one study. We need more. But if that's the case, then that probably speaks to the providers selecting the right animals and then training them very, very carefully so that they're gradually exposed to these extremely stressful and stressed out people, so that they learn to cope with it, and they're just not, it doesn't stress them out as much either. Now, for therapy animals, so these are animals that are involved in a goal-directed and structured program aimed at improving some sort of treatment. So, mental health, physical health outcomes that are trying to be improved in therapy animals. So there was a review. Now, this was looking at animal welfare and animal-assisted services. So not just therapy animals, but also animal-assisted education and animal-assisted activities. She found 9 papers. And there were physiological measures as well as behavioral and a cognitive task. And they had mixed findings. So there were some positive welfare indicators for animals working in these roles. So there was evidence of increased socialization, which makes sense because they would get out a lot and they'd meet a lot of different types of people. There was a good responsiveness to commands, which also makes sense because they'd be extensively trained for obedience and sort of good behavior. And then when off lead in dogs, there was reduced cortisol level. So there was not a lot of physiological stress. But they also found some negative indicators. So when on lead, cortisol increased. And there was also some evidence of reduced focus. So they were, not able to really pay attention to the task at hand sometimes. And then some papers found stereotypies. So, the sort of the repetitive behaviors that indicate stress and anxiety. And then a few papers found no effect at all. So, we still need to do plenty of work on this topic. But I just wanted to give you a little overview of what's been done in assistance and therapy animals. And then I wanted to tell you a little bit about the pet welfare research that's been done for companion animals, because I think the assumption is that pets, just by definition, must be experiencing good welfare. At least that was the case, maybe 5-10 years ago, maybe not anymore. But it's inaccurate to assume that the pet's welfare is fine just because they're a pet. And in fact, some of the research that has come out does contradict that assumption. So I was involved in a series of studies looking at pet owner management behaviors of various different types of species. And one of the things that we found was that 1/4 of dog owners let their dog roam freely outdoors. Now, this is in Australia. This is not allowed. It's illegal, and dogs will be picked up and taken to the council pound if they're roaming free. But 1/4 of dog owners just let them do it. And there are welfare risks. They could get hit by a car. They could get into a fight. They could with another dog or an animal. They could be potentially abused or stolen. We just don't know. And among rabbit owners, 1/3 never vaccinate their rabbits, so they're not sort of providing their basic veterinary needs as much as they should be. And then among pet snake owners, less than half have an enclosure large enough for the snake to fully stretch out. So I guess it's probably a bit like sort of spending your life in an airplane seat. You can never really sort of stretch out properly. So I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir here. You probably all know this, but in terms of ensuring welfare, I just have a couple of tips. Start from the start, so make sure that you select the right animal. If you have a wonderful pet or a wonderful, sort of potential pet that you're thinking about adopting, and it turns out that they just don't want to do the work that you have in mind for them, that's fine. They shouldn't have to do that, So really be careful about trying to select an animal that is going to really love the work that you're asking them to do. Know the animal, know your animal, because of course there are things that, there are sort of common behavioral indicators of stress and anxiety and things, but every dog, every animal has their own sort of quirks And so, over time, you will learn what it means when your cat lifts its left paw. That might mean that it's really, really happy. It might mean that it's not happy. So, these are things that you need to sort of develop over time, but really know your animal. Always be checking in. It doesn't have to be some sort of formal behavioral observation where you're ticking boxes and stuff. Just keep an eye on them and make sure that they are giving you the indicators that their own indicators that they're having fun, that they're happy, and that they're not giving you indicators of, oh, I'm not sure about this. I don't love it. Don't overfeed. One of the problems with welfare in some assistance and therapy animals was overfeeding. In one study, there was a dog, an autism assistance dog, who got so fat that he wouldn't fit into his harness anymore. So that was very uncomfortable. And that includes treats. So if you're going to be giving treats, then you need to offset that with less of their daily food. They need to get plenty of rest. This is really more of an issue, not so much for companion animals who probably get mostly too much rest, but working animals, they shouldn't be working all the time. They're not machines, just like us. They need breaks. Plenty of play. So, when they're not working, they need to be able to be silly animals and have a good time. Regular toilet breaks, of course. Make sure that they have plenty of opportunities to go potty. And then a routine. Again, probably less important for the companion animals who probably have too much of a routine. But for working animals, knowing when the day is going to begin, when food is coming, when the day ends is really important. Just as it's important for humans, it's really important for animals as well. There were a couple of questions coming through before the seminar, so I'm just going to quickly try to go through those, and then I'll be done and I can answer any more questions coming through. So somebody had asked about the difference between a therapy versus a service animal, and hopefully I have answered that one. A therapy animal is part of a goal-directed, structured therapeutic intervention, and a service animal is a synonym for assistance animal, which is an animal trained to provide disability support and has public access. A feral versus a stray animal in India or Thailand. Look, I'm not an expert on this. I don't really know very much about these animal types, but my general understanding is that a stray animal is one who is well socialized to humans. So they might be lost pets, or they may have grown up in a human household, and they would be potentially suitable for adoption into a pet home, or potentially even in a working role, depending on how well behaved they are and how sort of amenable they are to the training that would be required. On the other side, you have feral, which is as I understand it, they are not socialized to humans at all, or they're very, very little. And they usually grew up alone in this context of, not much human contact. So they probably not completely alone. They may have grown up with their species, but they wouldn't have been socialized to humans. So they're probably not going to be good for any sort of adoption as a pet or for any sort of working role. In the US, there has been a lot of confusion due to lack of consistent definitions. Yes, yes, that is correct. And hopefully over time that will sort of resolve. We're hoping to try to help that somewhat. And then somebody asked about animal interventions. I'm not 100% sure if I'm answering the question, but what I said is that we recommend phasing out the term animal-assisted intervention because for some people that word intervention has negative connotations. So it's like, when your family thinks, you need to go to rehab for alcohol addiction or something, or, among First Nations people, sometimes there were interventions that were aimed at, taking people's children away from them and stuff. So, and it implies that something is being done to the person as opposed to with the person and in collaboration with the person. So that's why we recommended animal-assisted services instead. Okay, there's the references. And if you would like to know more, feel free to email me. I don't know why I'm light gray down here, but that's my email address. And you can also follow us on our socials. So thanks very much.
Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation and for clarifying the terminologies. I love the fact that you did use examples all through, so it made it like easy to understand and easy to go with. So
thank you. But if there is any confusion, I'm happy to help try to clear it up. So.
Right, definitely. So if you do have questions, please type in the chat box. There are questions from the pre-conference questions that came in also that I would probably listen later. Okay, so okay. Lorato is asked, okay, so Lorato, this is such a very informative presentation. May I kindly ask if maybe somehow are we not anthropomorphizing these animals? What's your take on animal hoarding in the animal-human bond?
Oh, okay. So yeah, 2 points there. We potentially are anthropomorphizing a little bit. In all of these contexts and all of these working roles that animals are doing, it is important to remember that they don't see the world the way that we see the world. They have completely different experiences that we have. They are not humans. They're not small humans. They're not cute, fluffy humans. They are not people. They are animals, and we need to love and respect them for what they are. On the other hand, I have also seen the negative impacts of being too careful not to anthropomorphize. So, in a lot of the sort of original research looking at animal behavior was basically like, we can't read their minds, so let's do behavioral studies instead, which then became like extrapolated to, well, we can't know what's in an animal's mind, so they must not have one. And then that justifies all sorts of bad behavior towards animals. So I think that if I'm going to, I'd rather risk anthropomorphizing an animal than sort of turning them into robots and machines. So if I have to make a mistake one way or the other, I'd rather err on the side of anthropomorphization. But I definitely take your point, and I agree that we need to respect them as animals and not try to make them into what we are. In terms of hoarding, it's a really interesting thing, but it's not something I've done a lot of work on. I think there's a really fascinating pathology there, probably, but it's not something that I really know enough about that I could really say. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you so much. So someone earlier asked, says, well, was it a question? Anyway, someone commented earlier, so maybe if you could share your thoughts on this. Person says, unfortunately, in some countries, only dogs are allowed to be assistance service animals.
Yes, that is true. And I think that's just because historically it was dogs doing this sort of work. But one of the things that I really like about Australian legislation is that they say assistance animals. So somehow they were wise enough to, these politicians were able to understand that maybe one day it's not just going to be dogs who are doing this sort of work. And so they expanded. And so that's why we have assistance cats in Australia, which is, as I understand it, there would not be an assistance cat in the US, where only service dogs and miniature horses are recognized in the federal legislation. So I think it's probably just some sort of historical, it's just convention, but I don't think that it's necessarily the right approach. I think that there are definitely animals other than dogs who would be suitable for this work, but what makes dogs particularly amenable to it is that they really seem to enjoy working with us, and they're also very trainable. So it's relatively easy to get them to do just to sort of fill the roles that we want them to fill. Whereas with a cat, for example, they have their own agenda. Not every cat would be suitable for assistance work. Not every dog is either, to be fair. But with cats, it'd just be a little bit harder because you want to find the cat that was really wanted to be with you all the time and was also willing to be trained to perform the tasks that are necessary to do the work. Yeah, so birds are a really potentially good option. The only hesitation I would have is that as a rule, I think individuals might be great for this work of various species, but as a general rule, I would caution against trying to work with non-domesticated species. And of course, parrots are not domesticated species, although a lot of them live among humans and seem to love us. So individuals might be great for this sort of work, but with non-domesticated species generally, it'd be harder to say that the animal is definitely benefiting from the interaction in the way that the human would. And as I said before, we want to make sure that they're really having a great time. So if an individual parrot is great and loves it, then that's good, but it's not necessarily a recommendation that I give across the board.
Okay, thank you so much for your thoughts on those.
So you think it's a mistake to consider them non-domesticated? Okay, all right, well, you can argue that point.
Okay, so someone was asking earlier, I don't know, so the person was asking, what's the difference between feral and wild animals? Is that something you feel you can give context to?
Look, I think a feral animal generally is one that was from a domesticated species. So feral cats, feral dogs, feral horses. So these are animals that started out as domesticated, not the individuals themselves, but the entire species. And then at some point, they sort of went back out into the wild, and they sort of are living sort of the life of a wild animal, but they are technically a domesticated species, whereas a wild animal would be one that has never been a domesticated species. So the individual is from a wild species, is from a non-domesticated species. That'd be my definition, I suppose.
Okay, thank you so much. It does look like there's like questions are coming in and all. So someone was asking as well, I'm sure the person is getting all of this as new information and all, and is trying to process and everything. So the person is asking, can animal health technologists play the role of animal assistants in Nigeria?
I don't know. It's probably better to ask somebody in Nigeria about that. So I guess one question is, what is an animal health technologist and what would be an animal assistant in this context?
Right.
Because actually, I'm not familiar with either of those two terms.
Yeah. So I want to think the person is probably trying to look at it in terms of like an animal handler now. So I want to think it's the handler context the person is thinking about.
Yeah. Okay. So yes, that's the short answer. So basically, an animal handler, like in the context of animal-assisted therapies and education and so on, you can have people who are qualified themselves, who have a human qualification for teaching or therapy or whatever, or some sort of treatment, who also become the animal handler. So the psychologist, the treating psychologist, has a well-behaved cat that they want to do animal-assisted therapy work with, so they train up to learn all about cat behavior, and then they become an animal-assisted therapist with that cat. Another option is where the handler of the animal is not actually the person providing the treatment, but the animal is involved in the treatment. So there will be, in that sense, there would be a fourth person there, a fourth party there. So instead of the clinician / handler and the animal and the client, it would be the clinician, then the handler, and the animal and the client. And that for that role, you don't have to have a specific qualification in any sort of health or human service. You would just need to be able to be to train with your animal to become an animal handler in that context. So yes, it is technically possible. But if you're an animal health technologist who wants to do animal assisted therapy, then you would need to do that sort of that the four-party model, because you as the animal health technologist wouldn't be qualified to provide a treatment to a person. So you would need somebody else who does that role. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay.
So thank you for the presentations. Let me probably bring up one or two questions from the pre-conference, even though much of the questions from the pre-conference you've answered already during your presentation thus far. But I want to ask this. So someone was asking, are there special breeds to be used for human-animal interactions and animal-assisted services and all?
No, no. You want the animal that loves the job. So it doesn't really matter the breed necessarily. The one caution I would provide, though, is that some breeds are physically imposing and they can be intimidating to certain people. So if you've got a Rottweiler or a Doberman, even if they are the sweetest dog on the planet and they wouldn't hurt a fly, and as soon as you walk in, they just roll over on their backs and want to be, rubbed on their belly, some people will find them intimidating and scary. So in that sense, you might want to avoid the breeds that are particularly physically imposing and intimidating. But other than that, if you've got a really well-behaved, happy, an animal who just really wants to meet lots of different people and loves engaging with strangers, then that's really the most important thing, far more important than breed.
Okay, thank you so much. So all the other questions from the pre-conference questions, like I said, are things we've already answered, so I'll probably just slow down on those at the moment. But just to add to everything you said, thank you for the terminologies. And I feel it's a very vital topic, especially because before I had to take I took a course on animal-assisted therapy in 2020, and then concluded the course in 2021 with Oakland University. And before the course, I was going everywhere. I was writing online and all of that, talking about how I'm doing animal-assisted therapy and everything.
Yeah.
And then one of the first shockers for me when I took the course was to now discover that, oh, okay, according to what the internationally accepted standards and competencies are, I am not licensed enough to say as a therapy. Because I'm a human study professional, so I'm not licensed and all of that and everything. So that was one of the first things that I had to learn and all. So I think it's really vital that we are, especially in Africa, where this is beginning to probably just take off, a good number of countries like mine in Nigeria and for Dr. Shidi really in Botswana and in a few other places that this is just coming up. It's great that we are able to learn the right terminology from start and then go ahead with it. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much. It's been really nice to come here and chat with you about all of this. And like I said, feel free to shoot me an email, anybody, if you have any questions. I'm sorry that it's gray, but you should be able to read it. Yeah, I'll be happy to answer any questions. I promise I'm nice. I'm not going to ignore you. So.
All right, so any other questions, any comments? We would, anyway, so we'll stop recording at this point and then, so thank you so much everyone for joining. And we would look forward to tomorrow for the main conference. And that is the end.